Hannibal's elephants were designed to trigger one specific reaction: blind panic. When 80 tons of thundering muscle charge, the human brain has only one command: run. But Scipio Africanus broke that rule. He forced his men to override millions of years of evolution and stand perfectly still. They didn't raise their shields. They didn't brace for impact. They simply opened the door. In the middle of the chaos, Rome won by turning its army into a ghost, letting the enemy's greatest weapon strike nothing but air. The horizon did not simply darken. It began to vibrate with a frequency that was felt in the teeth long before it was heard by the ears. On the baked hardpan of Zama, the air had turned stagnant and heavy, stripping the moisture from thousands of throats until every breath tasted of copper and dry clay. The legions stood in a silence that felt unnatural, a rigid geometry of iron and red wool that usually projected invincibility, but today the formations felt brittle. The vibration in the ground grew from a tremor into a rhythmic sickness, a physical assault that traveled up through the soles of hobnailed sandals and rattled the bones of men who had conquered the known world. This was not the chaotic rumble of cavalry or the mechanical thud of marching infantry. This was something deeper, a geological disturbance that suggested the earth itself was rejecting the men standing upon it. Out of the heat haze, the source of the earthquake materialized not as an army, but as a shifting gray wall that blotted out the lower sky. The dust cloud that preceded them was thick and choking, carrying a scent that no Roman soldier had ever been trained to endure. It was a smell of musk, of fermented aggression, and of vast, unwashed biology. As the gray shapes coalesced within the dust, the scale of the threat destroyed any illusion of a fair fight. These were not machines of wood and leather that could be burned or broken. They were mountains of muscle and ivory, 80 distinct engines of destruction, fueled by fury and guided by madness. The sound of their trumpeting tore through the air, a high-pitched shriek that bypassed the logical mind and drilled directly into the primitive stem of the brain, triggering a biological alarm that had not been felt since humanity huddled in caves against the dark. The psychological weight of the approaching charge was heavier than the armor on the soldiers' backs. A gladius, 20 inches of Spanish steel, designed to parry and thrust against human opponents, suddenly felt like a child's toy. The shield, the scutum, that had deflected Gallic axes and Greek spears, seemed laughably fragile against legs the size of temple pillars. The men in the front rank watched the distance close, measuring their remaining lifespan in the thunderous beats of the impact. They could see the madness in the small, dark eyes of the beasts, eyes that rolled white with provoked rage. The ground beneath the soldiers' feet began to liquefy, the dust jumping inches into the air with every collective footfall of the herd. Logic dictated that standing still was a death sentence. Every instinct screamed that the formation was a coffin, that the straight lines of the legion were merely a convenient arrangement for the destruction to come. Yet the centurions remained silent, offering no order to brace, no command to lock shields. The army stood paralyzed not by discipline, but by the sheer, overwhelming absurdity of what was rushing to meet them. They were statues of flesh waiting to be crushed by the weight of history's most terrifying living weapon. Scipio Africanus watched the gray wall approach, not with the dread of a man facing monsters, but with the cold detachment of an architect observing a structural load test. To the young general, the battlefield was not a theater of heroism or a place for emotional gestures. It was a grid of mathematical probabilities where every variable could be countered with the correct geometric adjustment. He understood something that the terrified men in the ranks could not yet grasp: that an elephant, for all its terrifying size and crushing power, was not a soldier. It was an animal, governed by the simple, binary logic of the wild. It sought survival, not glory, and when faced with an obstacle, it would invariably choose the path of least resistance. The genius of Hannibal lay in using the terror of the beasts to force an enemy to compress, to bunch together in a desperate attempt to find safety in density, thereby creating a solid mass of humanity that the elephants could smash into like a hammer hitting an anvil. Scipio realized that to survive the hammer, he had to remove the anvil entirely. The order that rippled down the Roman line was quiet, precise, and utterly contrary to every instinct drilled into the legionaries since their first day of training. Standard Roman doctrine dictated that the maniples, the tactical units of the legion, should form a checkerboard pattern, the quincunx, which allowed for flexibility and rotation, but ultimately presented a unified front when the gaps were closed. Today, however, the gaps would not be closed. The tribunes and centurions moved among the men with vine staffs in hand, not to rally their spirits with speeches, but to enforce a terrifying new geometry. They shoved soldiers apart, striking anyone who tried to edge closer to his neighbor for comfort. They measured the distances with their strides, carving wide, empty avenues through the depth of the formation. These were not the accidental breaks of a disorganized line. They were deliberate, perfectly parallel corridors of empty air that ran from the front rank all the way to the rear of the army. The logic behind the formation was ruthless in its simplicity. Scipio was betting the lives of 30,000 men on the assumption that a charging beast would refuse to slam into a wall of spear points if it saw an open road right next to it. He was transforming the legion from a wall into a sieve. The plan required the heavy infantry, the principes and hastati, to suppress the most fundamental human urge to huddle together against danger. They had to stand isolated, their shoulders brushing against nothing but the hot wind, creating a vacuum that would invite the charge inside. It was a strategy of negative space, weaponizing the air itself. The columns of men were arranged like the pillars of a temple, solid and immovable, while the spaces between them became the intended traps. The illusion of safety was stripped away, replaced by a cold, hard trust in the spacing. The atmosphere within the ranks shifted from hot panic to a freezing, brittle discipline. The soldiers could feel the unnaturalness of the formation. To stand with a gap of 5 feet to your left and right, while the ground shook with the approach of death, required a mental paralysis that was almost hypnotic. The centurions paced the empty lanes, their presence a reminder that the order to hold position was absolute. They checked the alignment of the files, ensuring that the corridors were straight and unobstructed, clear of any debris or stray soldiers that might cause an animal to swerve. The entire army had become a machine designed for flow rather than resistance. The skirmishers, the velites, were positioned loosely at the front, ready to bait the trap, but the core of the plan relied on the heavy infantry remaining statuesque pillars of iron. It was a gamble of supreme arrogance masked as tactical innovation. Scipio was assuming that he could control the flow of a stampede as easily as an engineer diverted a river. He was imposing Roman order upon biological chaos, asserting that straight lines and measured intervals were superior to the raw, thundering mass of nature. The formation stood ready, a series of open mouths waiting to swallow the charge. The silence in the Roman lines was profound, broken only by the rhythmic breathing of men trying to slow their hearts, and the sharp crack of a centurion's staff against a shield that had drifted out of alignment. Everything was perfectly, terrifyingly organized. The lanes were open. The trap was set. The logic was sound. All that remained was to see if the monsters would agree to follow the rules of the game that Scipio had designed for them. The sensory overload began not with a single crash, but with a gradual disintegration of perception. As the gray wave closed the final 100 yards, the neat mathematical grid that Scipio had imposed on the battlefield began to warp under the sheer acoustic pressure of the charge. The sound was no longer just noise. It was a physical displacement of air that pressed against the eardrums and vibrated in the chest cavities of the waiting soldiers. The rhythmic thunder of the elephant's charge created a localized earthquake that made the simple act of standing still a battle for balance. Dust, kicked up in choking clouds, began to obscure the clear lines of sight that the entire strategy depended upon. The perfectly parallel corridors, designed with such precise geometry, started to blur at the edges as men flinched, swayed, or instinctively leaned away from the oncoming storm. In the front ranks, the first signs of the plan's fragility appeared. The Velites, the light skirmishers whose job was to harass and funnel the beasts, found their role suddenly complicated by the reality of the animal's speed. An elephant in a full charge moves with a terrifying swiftness that belies its bulk, covering ground faster than a galloping horse. The skirmishers, armed only with javelins and small round shields, realized too late that the distance they had judged as safe was evaporating in seconds. Their throws, intended to sting and steer the animals into the lanes, became hurried and erratic. Some javelins bounced harmlessly off the thick, wrinkled hide. Others missed entirely as hands shook with adrenaline. The animals, instead of being purely guided missiles, reacted with unpredictable spasms of rage. A few veered slightly off the intended course, their massive heads swinging like battering rams, threatening to smash into the pillars of heavy infantry rather than flow through the empty channels. The mahouts, perched high on the necks of the beasts, added another layer of chaotic variables. They were not passive riders but active combatants, driving goads with desperate force, screaming commands that were lost in the roar but felt in the animal's urgency. They saw the gaps in the Roman line, but in the swirling dust and confusion, the purpose of those gaps was not immediately clear. Some mahouts, mistaking the open lanes for a trap or a weakness, tried to steer their mounts directly into the solid blocks of infantry, seeking the collision that their training demanded. The elephants, caught between the pain of the goad and the visual confusion of the strange formation, hesitated in their trajectory. This hesitation was not a stop, but a dangerous wobble, a loss of the clean, linear momentum that Scipio's plan relied upon. A beast that charges straight is predictable. A beast that stumbles or swerves becomes a rolling boulder of destruction that respects no boundaries. Within the Roman ranks, the discipline held, but it was a discipline strained to the breaking point. The men could smell the animals now, a pungent mix of musk, filth, and the metallic tang of fierce sweat from the beasts themselves. The dust coated everything in a uniform gray, making it hard to distinguish friend from foe or safety from danger. A soldier in the second rank of a maniple watched as the man in front of him locked his knees, his shield trembling with a vibration that had nothing to do with the ground. The urge to close the ranks, to shut the gates and present a solid wall of iron, was almost overwhelming. It felt unnatural, even perverse, to leave the door open to such horror. Officers shouted commands to hold, their voices cracking, trying to reinforce the invisible walls of the corridors. But words were losing their meaning against the primal roar of the approaching herd. The first collision, when it threatened, did not happen cleanly. One elephant, perhaps wounded by a lucky javelin or simply maddened by the noise, drifted wide. It did not enter the lane smoothly, but clipped the edge of a maniple. The impact was not a full-on crush, but a glancing blow that sent 3 legionaries spinning into the air like discarded dolls. Their shields shattered, their armor crumpled, and the neat line of the formation buckled inward. It was a small breach, a minor error in the grand geometry, but it sent a shockwave of doubt down the line. The soldier next to the gap saw the shattered forms in the crimson stain, and for a split second, the illusion of the plan's perfection vanished. The empty lane was not a safe harbor. It was a gamble that could fail with a single misstep. Yet the order remained: hold the lanes. The gap in the maniple was filled instantly by the rear ranks stepping forward, stepping over the groaning wounded, re-establishing the straight line with a cold, mechanical efficiency that masked the terror beneath. The system absorbed the error, pretending it hadn't happened, pretending that the chaos could still be contained within straight lines. The dust swirled thicker, hiding the full extent of the danger, allowing the men to believe, for just a few moments longer, that the plan was working exactly as intended. The physics of the battlefield shifted from anticipation to kinetic reality in a heartbeat. The gray avalanche did not break upon the rocks of the legions. It poured through them. Scipio's gamble, born of cold logic, now manifested as a terrifying physical ordeal for the men standing on the edges of the empty lanes. The air itself seemed to be sucked out of the corridors by the sheer displacement of the rushing mass, creating a vacuum that tugged at shields and tunics, threatening to pull the soldiers into the stampede they were meant to avoid. The heat radiating from the beasts was palpable, a suffocating wave of animal warmth that smelled of wet hide and terror, washing over men who were already drowning in their own sweat. For the legionaries, the experience was a sensory violation. They were no longer soldiers fighting a distinct enemy. They were static components of a machine designed to channel a natural disaster. To stand inches away from a creature that stood 10 feet at the shoulder, to feel the ground jump and shudder with each footfall, required a suppression of instinct that bordered on catatonia. Eyes were fixed straight ahead, staring into the dust or at the back of the man in the rank before them, refusing to track the massive shapes blurring past in peripheral vision. To look was to acknowledge the danger, and to acknowledge the danger was to invite the flinch that would unravel the entire formation. The discipline held, but it was a rigid, brittle thing, maintained not by courage, but by a collective paralysis. The noise inside the formation was deafening, a localized storm of trumpeting screams and the heavy impact of weight hitting earth. The Mahouts, realizing too late that their charge had been swallowed by empty space, screamed in frustration and panic, their voices lost in the roar. Some tried to turn their beasts, to force them sideways into the flanks of the Roman maniples, but the momentum was too great. The animals, driven by their own terror in the path of least resistance, refused to check their speed. They became prisoners of their own velocity, carried forward by the very charge meant to destroy the enemy. The Roman soldiers, standing like the banks of a river in flood, felt the spray of saliva and dust, the brush of rough skin against shield rims, the wind of a passing trunk that could snap a man's neck like a dry twig. Yet the system was not without its cost. The edges of the lanes were not perfectly smooth. Here and there, a beast stumbled or swerved, its bulk clipping the line of infantry. Men were knocked aside not by attack, but by incidental contact, their forms crushed by the careless brush of a passing mountain. A shield boss crushed into a chest, a helmet spun backward by a flailing tail. Bones gave way under the pressure. These casualties were silent, swallowed by the noise, their gaps filled instantly by the rear ranks, stepping up with mechanical precision. The formation consumed its own fallen to maintain its shape. There was no time to check on the casualties, no space to drag them to safety. They were simply pressed into the dust by the boots of their comrades or the hooves of the following cavalry, becoming part of the terrain itself. The psychological strain of being a passive observer to one's own potential destruction began to erode the minds of the men. It was an unnatural act of war, to stand weapon in hand and do nothing while death rushed past at arm's length. The urge to strike out, to throw a pila, to thrust a gladius, to do anything to assert agency over the situation was a physical ache. But the orders were absolute. Hold the line. Do not engage. Let them pass. The soldiers became vessels for the fear they were not allowed to express, their muscles locked in a tension that burned as hotly as the exertion of combat. They were surviving, yes, but they were being hollowed out by the sheer helplessness of their role. The perfectly engineered trap was working, but it was grinding the humanity out of the men who formed its walls, turning them into unfeeling bricks in Scipio's grand design. The charge continued, a seemingly endless train of gray fury, and with every second, the line between discipline and madness grew thinner, until it was impossible to tell if the men were standing still because they were brave or because they were simply too terrified to move. The exit from the Roman formation was not the liberation the beast had sought, but a descent into a new and calculated hell. As the last of the gray leviathans thundered clear of the empty lanes, expecting the open freedom of the rearguard, the trap finally and violently snapped shut. The silence of the discipline that had allowed them to pass was instantly replaced by a wall of acoustic violence so intense it felt physical. A semicircle of Roman trumpeters, pre-positioned and waiting for this exact moment, raised their brass instruments and unleashed a synchronized, piercing dissonance directly at the sensitive ears of the confused animals. It was a sound designed not to signal, but to inflict shock, a shrieking assault that shattered the fragile cognitive bond between the mahouts and their mounts. The elephants, their senses already overloaded by the claustrophobia of the lanes, did not charge forward into the Roman reserve. They recoiled. The forward momentum that had been their greatest weapon instantly inverted, transforming kinetic energy into frantic, circular panic. Simultaneously, the Roman skirmishers, who had melted away moments before, re-emerged from the dust like ghosts, not to block the path, but to harry the flanks. They did not aim to slay, a dead elephant becomes a static obstacle, but to torment. Javelins struck the soft, wrinkled skin of the trunks and the sensitive hide behind the ears, driving the animals into a state of absolute terror. The beasts, now blind with shock and deafened by the brass scream, ceased to be instruments of war and reverted to their primal nature as prey animals seeking escape. But there was no escape to the front, blocked by a wall of spears, nor to the sides, hemmed in by the harassment. The only clear path, the only direction that promised a cessation of the agony, lay behind them. With agonizing slowness that belied their panic, the herd turned. The living siege engines rotated on their axis, their tusks swinging away from the Roman eagles and pointing back toward the very lines that had launched them. The catastrophe that followed was mechanical in its inevitability. The Carthaginian cavalry, positioned on the wings to exploit the chaos the elephants were supposed to create, now found themselves the target of that chaos. There was no time to communicate, no signal that could override the stampede. The mahouts, helpless atop their maddened mounts, could only watch as their beasts accelerated into a gallop, not against the enemy, but against their own brothers. The structural integrity of Hannibal's army, built on the precise interplay of combined arms, turned into a guarantee of ruin. The horses of the Carthaginian cavalry, smelling the musk of the panicked elephants, bolted in terror before contact was even made, dissolving the disciplined squadrons into a mob. But the infantry could not bolt. They were packed tight, shields locked, waiting for the order to advance, blind to the disaster rushing at them from their own rear. When the elephants hit the Carthaginian lines, they did not distinguish between Punic and Roman forces. They trampled the Numidian horsemen with the same savage efficiency they had been bred to use against legions. The sheer physics of the collision were grotesque. Armored men and horses were driven into the sand, their ranks crushed under the weight of the panic. The strict hierarchy of the army, the chain of command, the tactical spacing, the mutual support, became the very thing that ensured maximum casualties. The soldiers could not scatter because their own formation held them in place, trapping them in the path of the stampede. They were pinned by their own discipline, forced to hold the line against a force that was currently erasing it. The crushing weight of the beasts snapped the spine of the Carthaginian left wing, not through malice, but through the blind, terrified need of the animals to run until the pain stopped. The weapon had not just failed, it had been reflected, turning the master's genius into a mirror of devastation. The screams of the fallen were indistinguishable: Roman trumpets, Carthaginian horses, and the trumpeting of the elephants blending into a single, horrific chord of total systemic failure. The end of the battle did not arrive with a cheer or a final charge, but with a settling of dust that revealed the geometry of ruin. Hannibal Barca stood amidst the wreckage of his own masterpiece, watching the sun dip low over a field that had been transformed from a tactical grid into a wasteland. The silence that descended was heavy, punctuated only by the low groans of the wounded and the distant, exhausted snorting of the surviving beasts. The great elephants, once the embodiment of unstoppable force, now wandered aimlessly in the twilight, their sides heaving, their gray skin matted with dark stains that were not their own. They looked small against the vastness of the defeat, stripped of their mythic power, reduced to confused animals searching for water in a landscape of ruin. Scipio's legions stood where they had started, their lines reformed, their ranks dressed with a terrifying mechanical precision. The empty lanes that had swallowed the charge were gone, closed up as if they had never existed, leaving only the memory of the void. The Roman soldiers did not celebrate. They leaned on their pila, their faces masks of dust and sweat, their eyes hollowed out by the unnatural discipline they had maintained. They had not defeated the enemy by overpowering him. They had defeated him by refusing to play his game. They had become the negative space in Hannibal's equation, the zero that multiplied his strength into nothingness. The victory felt cold, devoid of the passion of combat, a triumph of intellect over instinct that left the victors feeling less like warriors and more like operators who had simply pulled a lever. For Hannibal, the realization was absolute. He had spent a lifetime perfecting the art of war, bending terrain and psychology to his will, only to be undone by a man who understood that the greatest weapon was not force, but the absence of it. The genius of Cannae, the nightmare of Rome, had been dismantled not by a superior maneuver, but by a refusal to engage on his terms. The elephants, the terror, the thunder, all of it had been rendered irrelevant by simple, empty air. The war was over not because his army was destroyed, though it was, but because the philosophy that drove it had been proven obsolete. The chaotic brilliance of the individual genius had been crushed by the systemic, replicable order of the machine. The field of Zama became a graveyard, not just for men and beasts, but for an era of warfare. The romantic notion of the unstoppable charge, of the decisive blow delivered by monsters, died in the dust alongside the Carthaginian dream. Rome had proven that nature could be tamed, that fear could be engineered out of existence, and that the world belonged not to the bold, but to the disciplined. As the night finally claimed the battlefield, the surviving elephants were rounded up or silenced, their forms becoming mounds in the darkness, monuments to a failed gamble. The empire that would rise from this silence would be built on the lesson of Zama, that there is no force on earth, no matter how terrifying, that cannot be broken by men who are willing to stand still and let it pass through them. The age of monsters was over. The age of the system had begun.